The whiskey wasn't doing much to warm the evening, but Charlie Hendricks kept his glass close anyway. The saloon in Cheyenne had filled up proper by 7 o'clock. Cowboys in from the range, railroad men between shifts, and a handful of young drivers fresh to the stagecoach routes. One of them, kid named Tommy, couldn't have been more than 22. He'd been running mail between Laramie and Rawlins for maybe 3 months. Still had that shine in his eye like the whole frontier was one grand adventure. "Mr. Hendricks," Tommy said, leaning against the bar, "you drove stage for what, 30 years?" "Near enough." Charlie took a sip, let the burn settle. 28, if you count honest. "Hauled a lot of mail-order brides, I bet." Charlie smiled at that. Every young driver thought the brides were the interesting cargo. "More than I care to count." "Any of those marriages actually work out?" Tommy asked. There was genuine curiosity there, not mockery. "I mean, seems like putting two strangers together and calling it marriage is asking for trouble." The other men at the bar quieted some. They knew Charlie had stories. He'd driven every route from the Montana Territory down to the Colorado line, seen every kind of passenger God could dream up. Charlie set his glass down careful. Let the question sit in the air a moment. "Most don't last," he said finally. "That's the truth of it. Woman gets off the coach, takes one look at what she's gotten herself into, and she's back on the eastbound by Sunday." He paused, watching the amber liquid catch the lamplight. "But let me tell you about one that did." The saloon seemed to lean in closer. "Let me tell you about the crying bride of Willow Creek." Tommy settled onto the stool beside him. The piano player in the corner let his tune fade to nothing. Even the bartender stopped his glass wiping to listen. "September of '73, Charlie began. "That's when it happened. I was running the Cheyenne to Willow Creek route twice a week back then. Good route mostly. Wasn't too rough on the coaches, and the stations were honest about their horses." He could still see it clear as yesterday. The Cheyenne station on a warm Thursday morning, gold light slanting through the dust. Coaches being loaded with mail, freight, and the occasional passenger brave enough or desperate enough to venture into the Wyoming Territory. "I'd hauled plenty of mail-order brides by then," Charlie continued. "They usually arrived one of 3 ways: nervous, which was most common, excited, which was rare, or angry, which happened more than you'd think." He shook his head, remembering. "But I'd never hauled one who arrived crying." The station had been busy that morning. Charlie remembered checking the hitch on the lead horse, a gray mare with a steady temperament. His coach could carry 6 passengers, but that day he only had 3. A whiskey drummer heading to Fort Sanders, a rancher's wife returning from visiting family in Denver, and the bride. She'd arrived in a hired carriage, alone, no family seeing her off, which should have been the first sign something wasn't right. Most brides came with mothers fussing over them, fathers looking stern and worried. This one stepped down from the carriage, holding a single carpet bag like it contained everything she'd ever owned. Maybe it did. Charlie had noticed the veil first, heavy black lace, the kind widows wore. Except she wasn't dressed for mourning otherwise, just a simple traveling dress in dusty blue, practical and well-made, but nothing fancy. "Miss," he'd called out, "you the passenger for Willow Creek?" She'd nodded without speaking, handed him her ticket with a gloved hand that trembled. The ticket read, "Miss Amelia Foster, Boston to Willow Creek, Wyoming Territory. Paid passage." "Welcome aboard," Charlie had said, trying for cheerful. "It's a long ride, but the weather's holding fair. We'll make good time." She'd climbed into the coach without a word, settled herself in the corner by the window, and turned her face away. That's when Charlie heard it, the smallest sound, quickly stifled. She was crying beneath that veil. The first hour out of Cheyenne, nobody said much. The whiskey drummer dozed with his hat over his face. The rancher's wife worked on some knitting, needles clicking steady as the wheels turned, and the bride cried, not loud, Charlie told the men in the saloon, not making a scene, just quiet tears that wouldn't stop, the kind that come from somewhere deep and won't be reasoned with. Every time the coach hit a rut, every time they passed another homestead or crossed another creek, Charlie would glance through the window at his passengers. The bride never moved from her corner, never lifted that veil, just sat there with her carpet bag clutched to her chest, like it was the only solid thing left in the world. At the first station, he'd tried to offer her water. She'd shaken her head. At the second station, the rancher's wife had attempted conversation. The bride had managed 2 words, "I'm fine." But she wasn't fine. Anyone with eyes could see that. The landscape rolled past, mile after mile. Wyoming in September was something to see. Prairie grass gone golden in the late summer heat. Sky so blue and wide it made a man feel small in the best kind of way. Antelope grazing in the distance, heads lifting as the coach rumbled by. Mountains rising purple on the horizon, still holding snow on their peaks. Most first-time passengers couldn't help but stare. The frontier had a way of catching your breath, making you believe in fresh starts and open possibilities. The crying bride never looked up once. Charlie found himself worrying. He'd seen women forced into arrangements they didn't want, seen families selling daughters to settle debts, seen desperate situations that made even a rough frontier marriage look better than whatever they were running from. But this felt different. This felt like a woman heading toward something she believed was a terrible mistake, and going anyway because she had no choice left. "You going to be all right, miss?" he'd finally asked at the third station, keeping his voice low so the others wouldn't hear. "If you need help, if this isn't what you want, I can put you on the eastbound tomorrow." She'd looked up at that. He still couldn't see her face through the veil, but her voice came clear enough. "Thank you, sir, but I've made my choice." Then she'd turned away again, and the tears had continued. They'd covered 140 miles that day. Started before dawn, pushed through midday heat, kept rolling as the sun dropped low and painted everything amber and orange. Charlie had driven that route so many times he could have done it blind. Past the Anderson Ranch with its new barn, through the creek crossing where the cottonwoods grew thick, up over Cemetery Ridge where the first settlers had buried their dead, down into the valley where Willow Creek sat, nestled like a promise of civilization in all that wild space. The town wasn't much, maybe 200 souls on a good day, one main street with wooden buildings that still smelled of fresh-cut lumber, a general store, blacksmith, saloon, church, and a handful of other establishments trying their best to look permanent. But it was growing. New families arriving every month, drawn by the railroad talk and the free land, and the chance to build something that belonged to them. The coach rattled to a stop in front of the station just as the September sun touched the horizon. Dust rose up in golden clouds, shimmering in the fading light. Charlie climbed down from the driver's seat, bones aching from the long day. He'd stretched, worked the stiffness from his shoulders, and moved to open the passenger door. The whiskey drummer stumbled out first, complaining about his back. The rancher's wife followed, looking around for her husband who was supposed to meet her. Then the bride appeared in the doorway. She still wore that veil, still clutched that carpet bag, still had tears streaming down her face, though Charlie couldn't see them, only sensed them somehow. And standing on the wooden platform, waiting with his hat in his hands, was the man who'd sent for her. Charlie described him to the men in the saloon, trying to paint the picture right. Tall fellow, Carrick Montgomery, 6 foot and some, with shoulders that came from years of real work. Age 31, though he looked older in the way frontier men often did. Sun and wind had weathered his face to bronze, put lines around his eyes that spoke of squinting at horizons. He wore his best clothes that day. Dark wool trousers, white shirt clean and pressed, vest that still had its buttons. He'd trimmed his beard fresh, slicked back his hair with some kind of pomade that wasn't quite controlling the curl. His hands kept moving, checking his pocket watch, adjusting his hat, brushing at invisible dust on his sleeve. Nervous, Charlie had thought. The man was nervous as a long-tailed cat in a room full of rocking chairs. Charlie knew Carrick some. Not well, but enough. The man had come through Willow Creek 5 years back with a stake from his army pay and a dream of building a ranch. He'd worked hard, kept honest, helped his neighbors when they needed it. Quiet sort, but steady. The kind of man who'd write a careful advertisement for a mail-order bride because he was tired of facing his land alone. "Miss Foster?" Carrick had called out, his voice carrying across the platform. The bride had frozen in the coach doorway. For a long moment Charlie thought she might refuse to come out at all, might just pull that door shut and demand to be taken back to Cheyenne. Then she'd step down. Small woman barely came up to Carrick's shoulder. The hem of her dusty blue dress touched the platform boards, and she stood there swaying slightly like the ground wasn't quite solid beneath her feet. Carrick moved forward, extending his hand. "I'm Carrick Montgomery. Welcome to Willow Creek." She took his hand. Charlie saw it even through her glove, the way she trembled, the way she could barely hold on. Then fresh tears spilled from beneath that veil. Her shoulders shook with the effort of holding back sobs. She pulled her hand away, fumbling for a handkerchief that was already damp from previous use. "I apologize, Mr. Montgomery," she managed, voice breaking on every word. "This is not how I intended our first meeting to be." Charlie had seen awkward meetings before. Bride takes one look at groom, disappointment clear on both faces, everyone forcing smiles that don't reach their eyes. But this was different. Carrick Montgomery didn't look disappointed. He looked concerned, genuinely worried for this weeping woman he'd never met before. A few folks had stopped to watch. Small towns being what they were, word had spread that Montgomery's bride was arriving today. Curiosity had drawn them to the station, though most had the decency to pretend they were there on other business. Carrick seemed to notice the eyes on them. He glanced around the platform, jaw tightening. Then he gently touched the bride's elbow, guiding her away from the coach toward a bench at the far end of the platform. "Come on," he said quietly. "Let's get you out of the crowd." She followed without resistance, sat down on the bench like her legs couldn't hold her up anymore. Carrick settled beside her, careful to leave space between them, respectful distance. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a clean handkerchief, offered it to her without a word. She stared at it for a moment, then took it with shaking hands. "Thank you," she whispered. Charlie had been unloading luggage from the coach, but he could hear them. Everyone could hear them, though most were pretending not to listen. What Carrick said next, though, that's what Charlie remembered clearest. The rancher had looked at this crying woman, this stranger who'd traveled 1,500 miles to marry him, and he'd said it plain and simple. "You don't have to pretend with me." The bride's head came up at that. Even through the veil, Charlie could sense her surprise. "Whatever's troubling you, Miss Foster," Carrick continued, his voice low and steady. "I reckon you've had a long journey to think on it. No need to force a smile on my account. No need to pretend everything's fine when it clearly isn't." She'd gone very still. Her hands stopped their nervous twisting of the handkerchief. "You're very kind, sir," she said finally. "I fear I may have made a terrible mistake." Charlie paused in his telling, took another sip of whiskey. The saloon was quiet as a church now. Every man there knew what usually came next in these stories. Bride backs out. Groom gets angry. Money changes hands. Someone ends up on the next coach out. But young Tommy leaned forward. What did he say to that? Charlie smiled. That's what made it different, what he said next. On that platform, in the fading September light, Carrick Montgomery had studied the weeping woman beside him. Then he'd asked the question direct. "Is it me? If I'm not what you expected, I'll understand. No hard feelings." "No," she'd interrupted, looking up at him through that veil. "No, Mr. Montgomery, it's not you. It's... She'd glanced around nervously, seeing the curious faces, trying not to stare. "May we speak somewhere more private?" Carrick had nodded, rose from the bench and moved to collect her trunk. Charlie had already set it aside with the other luggage, and Carrick hefted it like it weighed nothing. Carried it to his wagon, a sturdy farm wagon with good wheels and a canvas cover in case of rain. The horses in the traces were well kept. A matched pair of bays, patient and calm. Good ranch horses. Carrick had helped the bride up onto the wooden seat. His hands had been gentle, treating her like she might break. Then he'd climbed up beside her and taken up the reins. "My home is about 4 miles outside town," he'd explained. "We can talk freely there. Or I can take you to the hotel if you'd prefer." She'd clutched her carpetbag tighter. "Your home would be best, I think." He'd given the reins a gentle snap. The horses had leaned into their harness, and the wagon had rolled forward. Charlie had watched them go. The tall rancher and the crying bride heading out of town as the sun slipped below the horizon. He'd wondered, not for the first time, what made people take such chances. What made a woman board a train in Boston bound for a territory she'd never seen, heading toward a man she'd never met. And what made a man wait 5 years before admitting he was lonely enough to send for a wife. The wagon had disappeared around the bend in the road. Charlie had collected his pay from the station master and headed for a hot meal and a bed. He'd figured that was the last he'd see of Carrick Montgomery's mail-order bride. But he'd been wrong about that. They rode in silence for the first mile. The town fell away behind them, giving way to open prairie. The road wound through grassland painted gold by the evening sun. In the distance, mountains rose purple against the darkening sky. Carrick kept the horses to a steady walk. No hurry, letting the woman beside him gather herself. She'd finally lifted that veil, pushed it back from her face. Even in profile, even with her eyes red and swollen from crying, she was pretty. Honey blonde hair pinned up in a practical style. Features delicate but not fragile. Blue eyes that held intelligence alongside the tears. Young, Carrick thought. The advertisement had said 22, but seeing her now, she seemed even younger. Though maybe that was just the fear making her look vulnerable. "Mr. Montgomery," she said finally, her voice steadier now that they were alone, "I need to tell you something." He kept his eyes on the road. "I'm listening." She took a breath, let it out slow. "I lied to you." The words fell between them like stones. Carrick didn't respond right away. Just let the wagon wheels turn, let the horses find their rhythm. "About what exactly?" he asked, keeping his tone neutral. "In my letters." Her hands twisted together in her lap. "I told you I was a school teacher in Boston. That's true. But I didn't tell you why I left." The wagon hit a rut. Carrick steadied her with a hand on her arm, then withdrew it quickly. "Go on." She was quiet for another long moment. Then the words came tumbling out like she'd been holding them back for too long. "I didn't leave my position voluntarily. I was dismissed. My reputation was ruined." Carrick felt his stomach tighten. Every mail-order groom's fear right there. That the woman who answered his advertisement was running from something shameful, something that would follow her west and bring trouble to his door. But he'd told her she didn't have to pretend. Meant it too, so he kept his voice level. "What happened?" "The headmaster's son." The words came bitter. "He developed an attachment to me. I refused his advances. He became angry, told his father I had behaved inappropriately with him, that I had encouraged him." Carrick's jaw tightened. He knew that story, heard variations of it before. Powerful man's son takes interest in girl without protection. Girl refuses. Girl gets blamed. "And they believed him," he said. Not a question. She nodded. "My reputation was destroyed overnight. No respectable school would hire me afterward. I couldn't find work anywhere in Boston. I was ruined, Mr. Montgomery, completely ruined." They crested a small hill, and Carrick's ranch came into view. A modest 2-story house with a wide porch. Barn and outbuildings arranged practical around it. Corrals with good fencing. In the distance, cattle grazed across rolling grassland. Not much compared to the grand estates back east, but it was his, built with his own hands and honest work. "So you answered my advertisement," Carrick said quietly. "Yes." She looked at him directly now, those blue eyes still wet but meeting his gaze. "But I didn't tell you about the scandal. I was afraid you wouldn't consider me if you knew." She drew herself up straighter, like she was preparing for a blow. "I understand if you wish to nullify our arrangement. I can return to town tonight and take the next coach eastward. I'll pay you back for my passage. It may take time, but I'll pay every cent." Carrick slowed the wagon as they approached the ranch. In the yard, a dog started barking. Rusty, his 3-year-old shepherd mix, came bounding toward them with tail wagging. "That's Rusty," Carrick said, glad for something normal to talk about. "He's friendly, just enthusiastic." The dog circled the wagon, barking his greeting. The bride watched him, and for the first time since stepping off that coach, her expression softened just a little. Carrick brought the wagon to a stop in front of the house, set the brake, wrapped the reins careful around the handle. Then he turned to face her full on. "Miss Foster," he said, "may I speak plainly?" She nodded, bracing herself. "I'm not much for games or pretense. Out here, a person's judged by their actions more than rumors. What matters to me is whether you were truthful about wanting a real partnership, about being willing to work alongside me to build something worthwhile." He gestured toward the ranch, the land spreading out around them in the fading light. "This is my life's work. It's not much compared to Boston society, but it's mine. I advertised for a wife because I'm tired of facing it alone. I need a partner, not a servant. Someone who'll share the weight of it." The sun had dropped below the horizon now. The sky blazed orange and pink. The first stars were appearing in the east. "Now, you say you weren't entirely truthful about your circumstances," Carrick continued. "But seems to me you were truthful about the important parts. You said you wanted a fresh start. You said you were willing to work hard. You said you understood what marrying a rancher might entail." He met her eyes, held her gaze. "Were you lying about any of that?" She shook her head slowly. No, Mr. Montgomery. I meant every word of those letters. I do want a fresh start. I am willing to work hard, and I'm not afraid of difficulty." "Then the rest of it," Carrick paused, choosing his words. "Whatever happened in Boston, it stays in Boston. Out here you get to decide who you are, not some headmaster's son, not Boston society, you." Charlie's voice grew quiet in the saloon as he reached this part of the story. "I didn't see any of that myself," he told the men listening. "Learned it later from Martha Brennan, who got it from Amelia once they became friends. But I believe it happened just that way, because I saw what came after." Young Tommy was leaning so far forward he was nearly off his stool. "What happened next?" "Well," Charlie said, "I came through Willow Creek again 2 days later. Had to deliver some freight to the general store, and I saw them in town, saw Carrick Montgomery and his new wife." "They got married that fast?" Charlie nodded. "Married the very next Sunday. Preacher Jenkins performed the ceremony after regular services. I heard about it from half a dozen folks who were there." He took another sip of whiskey, remembering. "But here's the thing that stuck with me. When I saw them in town that Tuesday, she wasn't crying anymore. She was walking beside him, head up, looking around at everything like she was seeing it new. And when he introduced her to people, 'This is my wife, Amelia,' the way he said it, there was pride there. Real pride." Tommy shook his head in wonder. "All because he told her she didn't have to pretend?" "No," Charlie said. "That was just the beginning. That was him opening the door. What came after, that's the real story." He set his empty glass on the bar. "You want to know if mail-order marriages work? Most don't. But when they do, it's because two people decided to build something on truth instead of pretense, on partnership instead of desperation." The piano player had started up again, soft and low. The saloon was filling with evening noise once more, but the men around Charlie stayed quiet, waiting. "What happened to them?" Tommy asked. "Are they still together?" Charlie smiled. It was the smile of a man who'd seen something rare and knew it. "Let me tell you about the winter of '74, he said, "because that's when the real test came. That's when Amelia Montgomery proved she was more than just a crying bride who got lucky." He signaled the bartender for another round. "But first," he said, "you need to understand what she was walking into, what kind of man Carrick Montgomery really was, and why this marriage was never going to be simple, no matter how much truth they told each other." The men settled in closer. Outside, the Wyoming night was falling. Inside, Charlie Hendricks prepared to tell them about the long winter that changed everything. But that, he knew, was a story for the next telling. Charlie signaled the bartender for another whiskey. The bottle came down, amber liquid catching lamplight as it poured. "Now, I didn't see much of what happened that first week," he said, settling back into the story. "The Montgomery Ranch was 4 miles outside town, and I was back on the road to Cheyenne by Wednesday. But Martha Brennan lived 3 miles east of Carrick's place, closest neighbors, and Martha had a way of knowing things. He took a sip, let the burn settle. She told me later what those first days were like. How Amelia Montgomery, because she'd taken his name by then, how she started learning what she'd gotten herself into. The house was bigger than Amelia had expected. 2 stories, solid construction, with real glass in the windows. Not grand, but substantial. The kind of house that said a man had plans for the future. Carrick had carried her trunk inside that first evening, his boots echoing on wooden floors that smelled of fresh polish. He'd clearly spent time cleaning. Every surface gleamed. The large stone fireplace was swept clean, wood stacked ready beside it. Books lined shelves along one wall, more books than she'd expected a frontier rancher to own. "It's not fancy," he'd said, suddenly seeing his home through Eastern eyes. "But it's sound, roof doesn't leak, keeps the cold out come winter." Amelia had set down her carpetbag, removed her bonnet. For the first time, he'd seen her properly in good light. The tears had finally stopped, leaving her face pale but composed. "It's lovely," she'd said quietly, and he could tell she meant it. Rusty had pushed through the door behind them, tail wagging. The dog had gone straight to Amelia, sniffing at her skirts. She'd reached down tentatively, let him smell her hand, then scratched behind his ears. The dog had leaned into her touch, already won over. "He's a good judge of character," Carrick had said. That had pulled a small smile from her, the first he'd seen. Carrick had shown her upstairs, carrying her trunk. The bedroom he'd prepared was at the front of the house, overlooking the western range. He'd bought a new quilt from the general store, hung curtains that Martha Brennan had helped him sew. A small vase of wildflowers sat on the dresser, slightly wilted now but still holding color. "This is your room," he'd said, setting the trunk down. "Door has a lock if you want it. I'm across the hall." Amelia had looked at him, surprise clear on her face. "We're not married yet, Miss Foster," he'd explained. "The preacher comes through town every other Sunday. He'll be here this weekend. Until then," he'd gestured at the room. "This is yours, private." Relief had washed over her face so visibly that Carrick felt something tight in his chest. She'd expected to be claimed, expected him to assert rights he hadn't earned yet. "Thank you, Mr. Montgomery," she'd whispered. "That's most considerate." Charlie paused to let that settle with his listeners. Most mail-order grooms wouldn't have done that, he said. Would have figured they'd paid for passage. Contract was binding, might as well get what they paid for. But Carrick Montgomery wasn't most men. Young Tommy nodded thoughtfully. He was giving her a choice. More than that, Charlie said. He was showing her she could trust him, that his word meant something. And that mattered because of what came next. That first evening, Amelia had insisted on cooking supper despite her exhaustion. She'd found the kitchen well stocked. Carrick had prepared for her arrival, and put together a simple meal of salt pork, beans, and biscuits from a jar of sourdough starter she found in the pantry. They'd eaten together at the table, awkward and formal, making careful conversation about the journey, the weather, the ranch. 60 head of cattle right now, Carrick had explained. Started with just 12 5 years back, planning to double the herd in the next 2 years if the market holds. That's impressive, Amelia had said. You've accomplished a great deal on your own. He'd shrugged. Had help from neighbors when needed. That's how it works out here. Everyone pitches in. After supper, Carrick had insisted on washing the dishes while Amelia dried. The domestic task, performed together, had felt strangely intimate. When their hands had touched passing a plate, Amelia's cheeks had flushed. Then Carrick had done something that changed everything. He'd gone to the desk in the parlor and returned with a folded document, set it on the table between them. This is the deed to the ranch, he'd have said. Had a lawyer in Cheyenne draw it up last month. If we marry, half of everything becomes yours, legal and binding. I want my wife to be a true partner, not a housekeeper who works without stake in what we're building. Amelia had stared at the paper, speechless. In Boston, married women had no legal right to property. Everything they owned became their husband's by law. Here, this virtual stranger was offering her security that most women could never claim. "Why would you do this?" she'd finally asked. Carrick had met her eyes directly. "Because ranching is hard work. Days are long. Winters are brutal. If someone's going to face that alongside me, they deserve equal share in the rewards." He'd refolded the paper carefully. "Think on it. No decision needs making tonight." Charlie took another sip, the saloon quiet around him. "Martha told me that's when Amelia knew she wasn't going to leave," he said. "When she understood what kind of man Carrick Montgomery really was, but she didn't know the whole story yet. Didn't know what shadows he was carrying." "What shadows?" Tommy asked. Charlie's expression grew somber. "The war. Same shadows half the men in this territory carry, the things they saw, the things they did." It was the third evening. They'd fallen into a careful routine. Amelia cooking, both of them cleaning up together, then sitting in the parlor by the fire, reading or talking quietly. That night, Amelia had asked about the books on his shelves. History, poetry, even some novels, not what she'd expected from a cowboy. "My mother was a teacher," Carrick had said, "back in Pennsylvania. She made sure I had an education before the war came." "The war," Amelia had said softly. "You served?" His face had changed. Something shuddering closed behind his eyes. "Yes." The single word carried weight. Amelia had seen that look before. Boston had its share of veterans, men who'd come home different, men who woke screaming in the night, men who couldn't bear loud noises or crowds. "I'm sorry," she'd said. "I didn't mean to pry." Carrick had stood, moved to the window, looked out at the darkness beyond the glass. "I was engaged before the war," he'd said finally. "Girl named Elizabeth from my hometown. We'd planned to marry when I got back." Amelia had waited, sensing this was important. "But the man who left wasn't the man who came back." His voice was flat, careful. "Elizabeth tried to understand, she really did. But every time I'd wake up shouting, every time I couldn't explain what I'd seen, what I'd done, she looked at me different. Like I was a stranger wearing her fiancé's face." He'd turned back to face Amelia. "She broke the engagement 6 months after I mustered out. Said she wanted the man who'd left, not the one who returned. Can't blame her for that." "Is that why you came west?" Amelia had asked gently. "Partly. Needed to be somewhere new, somewhere people didn't know who I'd been before." He'd returned to his chair, sinking into it like the weight was suddenly too much. "Out here I could just be a rancher, just Carrick Montgomery with land and cattle and a future, not—" He'd stopped himself. "Not what?" For a long moment she'd thought he wouldn't answer. Then the words came quiet and raw. "Not the man who followed orders to burn civilian homes. Not the man who still hears an old woman screaming when the wind blows wrong." Charlie's voice dropped lower. The men in the saloon leaned closer. "That's when he told her about Stone's River," Charlie said. "December of '62, cold as hell and twice as dark. His unit got orders to deny supplies to the Confederates. Meant burning every homestead in a 10-mile stretch." He shook his head. "Most families cleared out when they saw the Union Army coming, but there was this one house. Old woman living alone. Refused to leave. Said she'd been born in that house, meant to die there too." The saloon was silent except for the crackle of the stove in the corner. Carrick's commanding officer gave the order anyway. "Burn it." The woman still inside. Charlie's jaw tightened. Carrick tried to get her out, went in himself while the fire was starting. But she fought him, wouldn't budge, and the smoke got too thick, flames too high. He had to leave her. "Jesus," someone muttered. He could hear her screaming as he stumbled out, Charlie continued. Heard it over the roar of the fire, and that sound, Martha said it followed him all the way to Wyoming, came back to him in nightmares, in the crackle of campfires, in the wind through dry grass. "That's why he built everything from stone when he could," Charlie said. "Why his house has that big stone fireplace instead of iron. Why he never burned brush if he could help it." The smell of smoke made him remember. In the parlor, Amelia had crossed to where Carrick sat. She'd knelt beside his chair, placed her hand gently on his. "You followed orders," she'd said softly. "It was war." "That's what Elizabeth said." His voice was bitter. It was war, you had to, as if that made it right, as if following orders erased the sound of her screaming. Amelia had been quiet for a moment, then she'd said something that surprised them both. "I understand guilt that won't leave." Carrick had looked at her. "The scandal in Boston? Not just that." She'd withdrawn her hand, folding both in her lap. "There's something I didn't tell you about the headmaster's son." She'd taken a breath. "He wrote me a letter. Before he made his accusation. A love letter, full of declarations and poetry. I knew I should destroy it immediately. Instead, I kept it for one night. Just one night. I read it before bed, and part of me, a small, foolish part, was flattered." Her voice had dropped to almost a whisper. "The next day I burned it. But ever since then I've wondered, did I encourage him somehow? By keeping that letter even one night, did I give him reason to think I returned his feelings? Is what happened partly my fault?" "No," Carrick had said firmly. "A man writing a letter doesn't give him rights. You did nothing wrong." "But I wondered," Amelia had said. "Boston society convinced me I must have done something, must have sent some signal, behaved improperly somehow. The guilt ate at me, made me doubt my own innocence." She'd met his eyes. "So I understand guilt that won't leave. Guilt for things outside your control. Guilt the world tells you to carry even when it isn't yours." Carrick had reached for her hand then, held it gently. "We're a pair, aren't we?" he'd said with a sad smile. "Both carrying weight we shouldn't have to bear." "Then maybe," Amelia had suggested, "we can help each other set it down." Charlie paused for another drink. "That was the moment," he said. "That's when it stopped being a business arrangement and started being something real. They'd shown each other their wounds, trusted each other with the ugly truth." He set his glass down. Sunday came. The preacher performed the ceremony after regular services. I wasn't there myself, but half the town was. Martha said Amelia wore a dress Madame Bouvier had altered from her traveling clothes, simple but pretty. And Carrick wore his army uniform, brushed clean and pressed. "Why the uniform?" Tommy asked. "Because he'd decided to stop hiding from who he'd been," Charlie said. Amelia had seen his worst and didn't flinch, so he wore it proud. Married her as the whole man, the soldier and the rancher both. The church had been full that Sunday. Word had spread through Willow Creek that Montgomery's mail-order bride was actually going through with it. Folks were curious. The church itself was simple. White clapboard, modest steeple, wooden pews worn smooth by use, morning light streamed through the windows, painting everything gold. Amelia had walked down the aisle alone. No father to give her away, no family to witness. But Martha Brennan had smiled warmly from the front pew, and Beatrice Wilson had dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, always ready to cry at weddings. Carrick had stood at the front in his Union blue, looking more nervous than he'd been at any battle. His hands had been steady, though, when he took Amelia's, steady when he slipped his mother's ring onto her finger. Reverend Jenkins had kept the ceremony brief. Traditional vows exchanged in clear voices. Then the words, "I now pronounce you man and wife. Mr. Montgomery, you may kiss your bride." Carrick had looked into Amelia's eyes, a question there. She'd given a small nod, and he'd leaned forward, pressing his lips gently to hers. The kiss had been brief but tender, a promise rather than a claim. The congregation had applauded as they'd turned to face the community as husband and wife. And if some of the single women in the back pews had looked disappointed, well, that was just the way of small towns. But one woman in particular had watched with an expression that wasn't quite disappointment and wasn't quite anger, something in between. Sarah Jenkins, the preacher's daughter, had sat 3 rows back. 24 years old, pretty in a proper way, with dark hair pinned severely and a dress that was fashionable but not frivolous. She'd watched Carrick kiss his bride, and her hands had gripped her Bible just a shade too tight. Charlie caught the question in Tommy's expression. "You're wondering about Sarah Jenkins," he said. "Yeah, there's a story there. Carrick had turned down her attentions about 2 years before Amelia arrived. Did it gentle from what I heard. Told her he wasn't the marrying kind, that he valued her friendship but couldn't offer more." Sarah took it hard, Tommy guessed. Took it personal, Charlie corrected. Convinced herself he'd come around eventually, that he just needed time. Then he goes and advertises for a mail-order bride instead of courting locally. Charlie shook his head. That stung. Made her wonder what was wrong with her that he'd rather marry a stranger. Did she cause trouble? Not right away, Charlie said. She was polite at the wedding. Congratulated them both. But there was ice under that politeness. You could feel it. The reception had been held in the churchyard. A potluck affair with every family bringing something. Fried chicken, cornbread, pies of every kind. Coffee boiled in big pots over open fires. Carrick had introduced Amelia to everyone. "This is my wife, Amelia," said it with such pride that she'd felt warmth spread through her chest. Martha Brennan had embraced her like a long-lost daughter. "We're so pleased Carrick finally found someone. That boy's been alone too long." Joseph Brennan, Martha's husband, had shaken Amelia's hand with a grip that was firm but kind. "You ever need anything, Mrs. Montgomery? We're just 3 miles east. Martha will be over soon enough to check on you anyway." Beatrice Wilson had chattered cheerfully about the general store, offering to help Amelia learn where everything was in town. "New faces are always welcome, especially ladies. Town's got far too many single men for comfort." But when Sarah Jenkins had approached, the temperature had dropped. "Mrs. Montgomery," Sarah had said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes, "welcome to Willow Creek. I hope you'll be very happy here." The words were correct. The tone was ice. "Thank you, Miss Jenkins," Amelia had replied carefully. "It must be quite an adjustment," Sarah had continued, "coming from Boston to a frontier ranch. So very different." "It is different," Amelia had agreed, "but I'm finding it suits me." Sarah's eyes had flicked to Carrick, then back. "How fortunate. Not everyone adapts so easily to ranch life. It can be quite harsh for those not accustomed to hard work." Carrick had stepped closer to Amelia, his hand finding the small of her back. A subtle claiming. "Amelia's stronger than she looks," he'd said quietly. "I suspect she'll surprise us all." Sarah's smile had frozen in place. She'd excused herself shortly after, claiming she needed to help her father with something. Martha had appeared at Amelia's elbow once Sarah was gone. "Don't mind her, dear," Martha had said quietly. "Sarah had hopes in that direction herself. Takes time to let go of dreams." 3 weeks passed, Charlie said, picking up the thread again. Quiet weeks, mostly. Carrick taught Amelia the ranch work. She learned fast, Martha said. Wasn't afraid to get her hands dirty. He smiled at the memory. Then came the harvest dance. Last Saturday in October. Town threw it every year to celebrate the end of growing season. Everyone came from miles around. Music, food, dancing until midnight. Tommy leaned forward. "Something happened at the dance?" "Something always happens at dances," Charlie said. "Put enough people together with whiskey and fiddle music, something's bound to spark." The town hall was packed that Saturday night. Lanterns hung from the rafters, casting warm light over the crowd. A fiddle player and his brother on the squeeze box provided music. The tables along the walls groaned under the weight of food. Carrick had been reluctant to attend. Crowds made him uneasy, especially when there was drinking. Too many sounds, too many bodies pressed close. It reminded him of things he'd rather forget. But Amelia had wanted to go, wanted to meet more of the community, to feel part of this new life she'd chosen. "We don't have to stay long," she'd promised. "Just an hour or two." So they'd come. Carrick in his good vest and clean shirt. Amelia in a dress she'd made over from fabric purchased at the general store. Simple calico, but it brought out the blue in her eyes. For the first hour, it had been pleasant. They'd danced twice. Carrick was surprisingly graceful for a man so tall. They'd talked with neighbors, sampled food, laughed at Joseph Brennan's terrible jokes. Then Wade Morrison arrived. Wade was Hank Morrison's older brother. Where Hank was steady and reliable, Wade was loud and mean when he drank. He owned a small spread north of town, ran it poorly, and blamed everyone else for his failures. He'd been drinking before he arrived. That was clear from the way he walked, the volume of his voice. "Montgomery! Wade had called across the hall. "Heard you finally bought yourself a bride. Let's see what you got for your money." The conversation around them had quieted. Carrick's jaw had tightened. "Wade," he'd said evenly, "you're drunk. Best head home before you say something you'll regret." "Regret?" Wade had laughed, pushing through the crowd toward them. "Only regret is I didn't think of mail ordering first. Could have saved myself the trouble of courting." His eyes had raked over Amelia in a way that made her skin crawl. "How much did this one cost you? She worth the freight?" Carrick had moved in front of Amelia, his body a wall between her and Wade. "That's enough," Carrick had said, his voice dropping to something dangerous. "Apologize to my wife, then leave." But Wade was too drunk or too mean to back down. "Wife," he'd sneered. "That what we're calling them now? Pretty words for what amounts to buying a woman like you'd buy a horse. Least with a horse you can inspect the teeth before paying." Something in Carrick had snapped. Amelia had seen it, the way his hands curled into fists, the way his breathing changed. This wasn't the gentle rancher she'd been living with. This was the soldier, the man who'd survived 3 years of war. He'd taken a step toward Wade. Charlie paused, building the tension. "That's when Amelia did something nobody expected," he said. This quiet Eastern lady, married barely 3 weeks, who'd spent her whole life being proper and polite, she stepped between them. "Between 2 men about to fight?" Tommy asked, disbelieving. "Stepped right up," Charlie confirmed. Put herself between Carrick and Wade Morrison, looked Wade dead in the eye. "Mr. Morrison," Amelia had said, her voice calm and clear. The whole hall could hear her. Wade had blinked, surprised to be addressed directly. "You seem to be under a misapprehension," Amelia had continued. "I cost my husband nothing. He offered me everything. There's a difference." She'd stood straight, chin up, every inch the schoolteacher she'd been. "I came to Wyoming seeking a partnership with a good man. I found one. That you cannot understand the difference between purchasing property and choosing a partner speaks more to your character than mine." The hall had gone utterly silent. "Now," Amelia had said, "you've had too much to drink and you're embarrassing yourself. I suggest you leave before you embarrass yourself further." Wade's face had flushed red. He'd opened his mouth, then closed it, opened it again. "You can't talk to me like—" "She just did," Carrick had said quietly, his hand gentle on Amelia's shoulder. "And she's right. Time for you to go, Wade." Joseph Brennan and 2 other men had materialized at Wade's elbows. "Come on, Wade. We'll get you home." Wade had allowed himself to be escorted out, muttering curses under his breath. The fiddle music had started up again after a moment. Conversation had resumed. But everyone in that hall had seen something important. They'd seen Carrick Montgomery's mail-order bride stand her ground with quiet dignity. They'd seen her defend herself with words sharp as any blade. They'd seen her refuse to be shamed, and they'd seen Carrick look at his wife with something that went beyond respect, something close to awe. Sarah Jenkins had been watching from across the room. She'd seen it too, and something in her expression had shifted. Not all the way to acceptance yet, but the beginning of understanding. Charlie took a long drink, nearly emptying his glass. After that night, people in Willow Creek stopped seeing Amelia as Montgomery's mail-order bride, he said. Started seeing her as Amelia Montgomery, period, a woman with spine, someone who belonged. He set the glass down. But that's not the end of this part of the story, because 3 days later, Amelia found something that changed everything. The men around the bar leaned closer. She was organizing Carrick's desk. He'd asked her to help sort through papers, file things proper, and at the bottom of a drawer, under some old receipts, she found a letter. It was a Tuesday afternoon. Carrick had ridden out to check the north pasture. Amelia had been working in the house, putting things in order, making the space truly theirs instead of just his. The desk had been a mess of papers, ranch accounts, bills of sale, correspondence with buyers. Carrick was meticulous about his business, but his filing system left something to be desired. Amelia had been sorting things into neat stacks when she'd found the envelope. It was addressed to Carrick Montgomery, postmarked Boston, dated August 15, 1873, 2 weeks before she'd answered his advertisement. Her hands had trembled as she'd opened it. She'd told herself she shouldn't read his mail, but her name was in the first line, visible through the gap in the envelope. She'd pulled out the letter. Mr. Montgomery, regarding your inquiry about Miss Amelia Foster, I must advise you of certain facts that may influence your decision. Miss Foster was indeed employed as a teacher at the Worthington Academy until recently. However, she was dismissed under circumstances involving improper conduct with a student's family member. While the details remained somewhat unclear, the scandal was sufficient to render her unemployable in Boston educational circles. Her family, while respectable, has distanced themselves from her situation. I cannot in good conscience recommend Miss Foster as a suitable wife for a man of your standing without making you aware of these circumstances. What you choose to do with this information is, of course, your own affair. Respectfully, Harrison Blackwood, attorney at law. Amelia had read it twice, 3 times. Each time the words hit harder. Carrick had known, before she'd answered his advertisement, before she'd traveled 1,500 miles, before she'd stood weeping on that platform, terrified he'd reject her when he learned the truth. He'd already known. He'd known, and he'd written back to her anyway, accepted her anyway. Let her suffer through that confession. Let her cry and apologize and offer to leave, all while knowing the whole time. The letter fell from her hands. The front door opened. Carrick's boots on the wooden floor. "Amelia, I'm back. Thought we could—" He'd stopped when he saw her face, saw the letter on the floor. "Amelia, you knew." Her voice was flat. "You knew about the scandal before I told you." Carrick had gone very still. "Yes. You let me suffer." The flatness was giving way to something hotter. "You let me cry and apologize and think you might reject me. You let me believe I was confessing something you didn't know, all while you'd already investigated me like I was a criminal." It wasn't like that. Then what was it like? She'd stood, facing him across the parlor. "You had some Boston lawyer dig into my past, find out my secrets, and then you just—" "What? Decided I was acceptable despite my flaws?" "No." Carrick's voice was firm. "I wanted the truth. So I found out what Boston was saying about you. And I learned that the headmaster's son had made similar accusations against 2 other teachers before you, that his father had covered it up both times, that you were innocent." He'd taken a step toward her. "I chose you knowing the truth. I chose you before you ever answered my advertisement." "But you never told me." Amelia's hands had clenched into fists. "You let me think. You made me believe—" "I wanted you to trust me by choice," Carrick had said quietly. "Not because I already knew. I wanted you to tell me yourself, when you were ready, when you felt safe enough to be honest." "How can I trust you now?" Amelia's voice had broken. "How can I trust anything between us when it started with you keeping this from me? I was trying to protect—" "I don't need protection." The words had come out sharp. "I needed honesty. I needed—" She'd stopped, turned away from him. "I need to think. Amelia, please." She'd held up a hand without looking at him. "Just give me time." Charlie's voice was somber now. She spent that night in her old room, the one he'd given her that first night, with the lock on the door. He slept across the hall, or tried to. Neither of them got much rest. He shook his head. Next morning, Martha Brennan came by with eggs from her chickens. Found Amelia sitting on the porch, eyes red from crying. Carrick in the barn, looking like he'd been kicked by a horse. "What did Martha do?" Tommy asked. "What Martha always did," Charlie said. She sat down beside Amelia and listened, let the whole story spill out. Then she said something that made all the difference. "Did he lie to you?" Martha had asked, settling her bulk onto the porch bench. "He kept the truth from me," Amelia had said. "That's not what I asked." "Did he lie? Did he promise something false? Say something that wasn't true?" Amelia had been quiet, thinking. "No," she'd admitted finally. "He never lied. He just didn't tell me." Martha had nodded. Men are fools sometimes, even good men. They think keeping secrets is the same as protecting, think not telling something is kinder than speaking truth. She'd patted Amelia's hand. But here's what matters, dear. His heart. Was it right? When he investigated your past, was he trying to protect himself or trying to find the truth? When he kept quiet about that letter, was he trying to manipulate you or trying to give you space to come to him freely? Amelia had wiped at her eyes. I don't know. I think you do, Martha had said gently. You've been living with him near a month now. You've seen who he is when nobody's watching. You've seen how he treats you, how he treats his animals, how he treats his land. What does your heart say about his heart? Charlie finished his whiskey. That's where I'll leave this part of the story, he said, with Amelia on that porch, trying to decide if she could forgive Carrick for keeping the truth from her, trying to figure out if a marriage built on his secret knowledge could still be built on trust. Tommy looked frustrated. But what happened? Did she forgive him? Charlie smiled. That's a story for the next telling. But I'll say this much. November was coming. And with November came the snow. And with the snow came a test that would either break them apart for good or forge them into something stronger than either of them could be alone. He stood, settling his hat on his head. Sometimes the hardest thing in marriage isn't the big betrayals, it's the small ones. The secrets kept for what seemed like good reasons. The truths withheld to spare feelings. Those are the things that can crack a foundation if you're not careful. He looked around at the men listening. Carrick and Amelia Montgomery, they'd built something real in those first weeks. But now they had to decide if it was strong enough to survive doubt. And that's a question every married couple has to answer eventually. Charlie headed for the door, leaving the men to think on that. Outside, the Wyoming night was cold and clear. Winter was coming early this year. He could smell it on the wind. Just like it had come early in '73, bringing with it the longest, hardest winter Willow Creek had ever seen. The winter that would change everything. 2 days later, Charlie found himself back in Cheyenne with a gap in his schedule. The saloon had emptied some. It was a Wednesday evening, and working men had to be up early. But Tommy and a few others remained, nursing drinks and waiting. They looked up when Charlie walked in, hope plain on their faces. "You come back to finish the story?" Tommy asked. Charlie hung his coat, settled onto his usual stool. "If you're buying the whiskey, I'm telling the tale." The bartender poured without being asked. Charlie took a sip, let the warmth settle, then picked up where he'd left off. So there was Amelia on the porch, trying to decide if she could forgive a man for knowing her secrets before she'd told them. And Carrick in the barn, wondering if he'd destroyed the only good thing he'd found since the war. It was Martha who'd brought them back together, though she'd deny it if you asked her. After their talk on the porch, Martha had sent Amelia inside to wash her face. Then she'd marched herself out to the barn where Carrick was mucking stalls with more violence than the job required. "Boy," she'd said, Martha called every man under 50 boy, "you want to tell me what you were thinking?" Carrick had stopped, pitchfork in hand. "I was trying to protect her." "From what? The truth?" "She'd already lived the truth, Carrick. Boston made sure of that." Martha had crossed her arms. "What you were really protecting was yourself, making sure you knew what you were getting before you committed. Can't blame you for that, but don't dress it up as chivalry." Carrick had looked at her, jaw tight. "The question," Martha had continued, "is what you're going to do now. You going to hide in this barn feeling sorry for yourself, or you going to go in that house and have an honest conversation with your wife?" "What if she won't forgive me?" "Then she won't, but at least you'll know." Martha had softened slightly. "That girl in there, she's stronger than you think, stronger than she thinks. But she needs to know you trust her strength, that you're not going to treat her like fragile china that might break if you tell her hard truths." She'd headed for the door, then paused. "Love isn't about keeping each other safe from pain, Carrick. It's about facing the pain together. Remember that." Charlie paused for a drink. So Carrick went into the house, found Amelia in the kitchen, pretending to be very interested in peeling potatoes. They stood there for a long moment, neither quite knowing how to start. "I'm sorry," Carrick had said finally. "I was wrong to keep that letter from you." Amelia had set down the potato, the knife, turned to face him. "Why did you investigate me?" He'd met her eyes directly. Because I'd been burned before. Elizabeth, after we broke our engagement, I learned she'd been writing to someone else the whole time I was away, keeping secrets. When I decided to advertise for a wife, I wanted to know the truth from the start. So you didn't trust me. I didn't trust my own judgment, Carrick had corrected. After Elizabeth, I doubted my ability to see people clearly, so I went looking for facts instead. Amelia had absorbed this. And what did those facts tell you? That you'd been treated unjustly, that the headmaster's son had a pattern of making accusations when women rejected him, that your family had failed you when they should have stood by you. His voice had grown fierce. That you deserved better than what Boston gave you. Then why didn't you tell me you knew? Carrick had run a hand through his hair, frustrated with himself. Because I wanted you to choose to trust me. I wanted that confession you gave me on the wagon. That was real. That was you being brave enough to tell me the truth even though you were terrified. If I'd told you I already knew, that moment wouldn't have been yours. It would have been me taking away your chance to be honest on your own terms. Amelia had been quiet for a long moment. That's a fine distinction, she'd said finally, between giving me the choice and manipulating the situation so I'd make the choice you wanted. I know, Carrick had stepped closer. And maybe I was manipulating. Maybe I was selfish. But Amelia, that moment when you told me the truth, when you offered to leave rather than start our marriage with a lie, that's when I knew for certain you were someone I could build a life with. He'd reached for her hand tentatively. She'd let him take it. I'm not asking you to forget I kept that letter secret. I'm asking if you can forgive it. If we can move forward knowing we both made mistakes, but we're trying to do better. Amelia had looked down at their joined hands. His were scarred and calloused from ranch work. Hers were softer, but developing calluses of their own from learning this new life. I can forgive it, she'd said quietly. But Carrick, no more secrets. Not the kind that matter. If we're partners, we need to trust each other with the truth, even when it's hard. No more secrets, he'd agreed. I promise. She'd stepped into his arms then, let him hold her while she held him back. We're quite a pair, she'd murmured against his chest. Both of us carrying wounds, both of us trying to figure out how to heal. Maybe that's why it works, Carrick had said. We understand each other's scars. After that, Charlie said, they were stronger, tested. They'd had their first real fight and come through it. That matters in a marriage, proves you can weather storms together. He took another sip. But they were about to face a different kind of storm. The kind that comes with wind and snow and cold that can kill you if you're not prepared. The first snow came early that year, November 5th, nearly 3 weeks before it was due. Carrick had woken to find everything white, snow still falling thick and heavy. This isn't right, he'd said, standing at the window. It's too early, too much. Amelia had joined him, wrapped in the quilt from their bed. They'd been sharing a room for 2 weeks now, the marriage fully consummated, though neither spoke of it outside their private moments. Is it dangerous? She'd asked. Could be. If it keeps up, if winter sets in hard this early, we could be in for a rough season. He'd turned to her. We need to prepare. Bring the cattle in closer. Stock extra feed. Make sure we have supplies laid in for a long haul. Amelia had nodded. Tell me what to do. They'd spent the next 2 weeks working harder than Amelia had ever worked in her life. Up before dawn, working until dark, bringing hay down from the storage loft, moving cattle to pastures closer to the barn, checking and rechecking the house for drafts, stuffing gaps with cloth and paper. Carrick had taught her to shoot properly, not just the warning shots she'd fired at the harvest dance, but real marksmanship. Wolves come down from the high country when it's cold, he'd explained. You need to be able to protect yourself and the stock. She'd learned. Her shoulder had ached from the rifle's kick, but she'd learned. By mid-November, they were as ready as they could be. The ranch was buttoned up tight. Supplies were laid in, the cattle were close, and the horses were stabled. Then the letter arrived. Charlie set his glass down carefully. I brought that letter myself, he said. November 20th. Last run before the roads got too bad for regular coach service. Had a whole bag of mail for Willow Creek, and right on top was a letter addressed to Mrs. Amelia Montgomery. Return address? Boston. Amelia had recognized her father's handwriting immediately. Her hands had trembled as she'd broken the seal. Dearest Amelia, your sister has informed us of your marriage to Mr. Montgomery. While we are disappointed you did not consult us before taking such a drastic step, we pray you have found happiness in Wyoming. However, I write with news that may influence your situation. The matter involving the headmaster's son has been resolved. Young Mr. Worthington, faced with threat of legal action, has publicly confessed to making false accusations against you. Your name has been cleared completely in Boston society. The Worthington Academy has extended a formal apology and an offer to reinstate your position at an increased salary. Additionally, the Hamilton School, far more prestigious, has indicated they would welcome your application should you choose to return. Your mother and I believe this changes matters considerably. There is no longer any reason for you to remain in self-imposed exile. We have enclosed funds sufficient for your return passage and additional support should you require it. We expect to hear from you soon regarding your plans. Your father, Harrison Foster. Amelia had read it twice, then handed it silently to Carrick. He'd read it slowly, his expression unreadable. When he finished, he'd folded it carefully and handed it back. "What do you want to do?" he'd asked, his voice carefully neutral. Amelia had moved to the window. Outside, snow was falling again, not heavy, but steady. The landscape was white and clean, stretching endlessly toward mountains she could barely see through the gray. "I want to write a letter," she'd said finally. She'd sat at the desk, taken out paper and pen, written carefully while Carrick watched from across the room, giving her space. When she'd finished, she'd read it aloud to him. "Dear Father, I am grateful to learn my name has been cleared in Boston. It is a relief to know the truth has finally been acknowledged. However, I will not be returning. Wyoming is my home now. My husband is here, my life is here, and my future is here. The woman who left Boston seeking escape no longer exists. In her place is someone stronger, someone who has found purpose and partnership in ways I never imagined possible. Please thank Mother for her concern, but I am exactly where I choose to be. I hope someday you will understand. Your daughter, Amelia Montgomery." Carrick had been quiet for a long moment after she'd finished reading. "You're certain?" he'd asked. "You're giving up a prestigious teaching position, your family, everything familiar." "I'm not giving up anything," Amelia had interrupted. "I'm choosing something better." She'd crossed to him, taken his hands. "You believed me when I had nothing to prove my innocence. That's worth more than Boston's apology will ever be." Carrick had pulled her close then, held her like she was something precious. "I love you," he'd said. The first time either of them had spoken those words aloud. "I love you too," she'd whispered back. Charlie paused, letting the moment settle. "That letter went out on my next run," he said. "November 23rd. And I figured that was the end of it. The Boston chapter closed. Amelia had made her choice." His expression darkened. "But I was wrong. Because 12 days later, I came back through Willow Creek with 2 unexpected passengers." Tommy leaned forward. "Who?" "Mr. and Mrs. Harrison Foster," Charlie said. "Amelia's parents. Come all the way from Boston to convince their daughter to come home." The coach had arrived on December 5th. The weather had turned bitter cold, but the roads were still passable, barely. Charlie had tried to warn the Fosters. "Folks," he'd said when they'd boarded in Cheyenne, "you sure about this? Weather's getting worse. Might not be able to get you back out for weeks if the snow sets in." Harrison Foster was a man in his 50s, well-dressed in Eastern fashion. His wife, Constance, was a small, neat woman who looked like she'd never been dirty a day in her life. "We are quite certain," Mr. Foster had said crisply. "Our daughter needs to be brought to reason. This frontier nonsense has gone on long enough." Charlie had shared a look with his relief driver. This wasn't going to end well. The Fosters had been silent for most of the journey, wrapped in their fine coats, looking at the Wyoming landscape with obvious distaste. When they'd arrived in Willow Creek, Charlie had directed them to the hotel. "I'll send word to the Montgomery Ranch that you're here." "That won't be necessary," Mr. Foster had said. "We'll hire a wagon. I assume such things are available even in a town this primitive?" Charlie had helped them arrange transportation, watched them drive off toward Carrick's ranch with a sense of foreboding. This was not going to go well. Amelia had been kneading bread dough when she'd heard the wagon. She'd wiped her hands on her apron, gone to the window, then frozen. Her parents were climbing down from a hired wagon. Her mother was looking at the ranch house with an expression of barely concealed horror. Her father was paying the driver, his back straight and disapproving. "Carrick," Amelia had called, her voice strange. He'd come from the barn, stopped when he saw the wagon, the strangers. "Who?" "My parents." Amelia had been moving toward the door even as she said it. Carrick had followed, catching up to her on the porch. Harrison Foster had looked up at his daughter. His expression had been impossible to read. "Amelia." "Father." "Mother." Amelia had descended the porch steps. "This is unexpected." Clearly, Mrs. Foster had looked at her daughter's flour-dusted dress, her work-roughened hands, her wind-reddened cheeks. "My dear, you look positively feral." Charlie took a long drink. "That's how it started," he said. Mrs. Foster comparing the ranch to a barn. Mr. Foster asking Carrick what his financial prospects were. Both of them making it clear they thought Amelia had married beneath herself. "How did Carrick take it?" Tommy asked. "Like a gentleman," Charlie said, "which had to cost him. But Amelia, she held her ground, invited them inside, offered them coffee, acted like a woman in her own home instead of a girl in her parents' shadow." The parlor had been warm from the fire, comfortable in the way frontier homes were comfortable, functional, lived in, real. Mrs. Foster had perched on the edge of the sofa like she was afraid of contamination. "Amelia, dear," she'd said, "we received your letter. Your father and I felt we needed to come personally to discuss this matter." "There's nothing to discuss," Amelia had said calmly. "I'm not returning to Boston." "Don't be ridiculous," her father had interjected. "Your name has been cleared. You have excellent prospects. There's no reason to remain in this—" He'd gestured around. "Wilderness." "I have a husband," Amelia had said. "A home. A life I've built." "A life?" Her mother's voice had risen. "Amelia, you're doing manual labor. I saw you through the window kneading bread like a common servant. You were a teacher. You had culture, refinement." "I still teach," Amelia had interrupted. "The town is building a school. I'll teach there, come spring." "Teaching frontier children their letters is hardly comparable to—" "Mother." Amelia's voice had been firm. "I am happy here, truly happy, in ways I never was in Boston." Mr. Foster had turned to Carrick, who'd been standing by the fireplace, silent until now. "Mr. Montgomery," he'd said, "you seem like a reasonable man. Surely you can see that my daughter is accustomed to a certain standard of living, that this," another dismissive gesture, "is beneath her station." Carrick had straightened, his expression carefully neutral. "Your daughter, sir, is one of the strongest, most capable women I've ever met. She's learned to manage a ranch, to work cattle, to shoot straight and ride hard. She's earned the respect of this entire community through her own efforts." "You've turned her into a laborer," Mrs. Foster had accused. "I've given her the chance to be a partner," Carrick had corrected, "something Boston never offered." "Partner?" Mr. Foster had stood. "Is that what you call it? She owns half this property, I assume? Has legal rights to—" "She owns exactly half," Carrick had said. "Legal deed, drawn up by a lawyer in Cheyenne. Half of everything is hers by right, not by my permission." That had given Mr. Foster pause. "Even so," he'd continued, "marriage entered into under such circumstances, a young woman in distress, far from family, essentially desperate. Such a marriage could be annulled. I'm prepared to compensate you for your trouble, Mr. Montgomery." The room had gone very cold. "You're offering to buy your daughter back?" Carrick's voice had been quiet, dangerous. I'm offering to correct a mistake. Amelia was not in her right mind when she agreed to this arrangement. She was fleeing scandal, not thinking clearly. Father, that's enough. Amelia had stood, her hands clenched at her sides. I was thinking more clearly than I'd ever thought before. I knew exactly what I was choosing. You were choosing escape, her mother had said. Not love, not a real life. You're wrong. Amelia had moved to stand beside Carrick. Their hands had found each other naturally. I chose partnership. I chose honesty. I chose a man who believes in my strength instead of my weakness. She'd looked at her parents, these people who'd raised her but never truly seen her. I am not the daughter you remember. I'm not the woman who left Boston in shame. I'm someone new, someone better, and I'm asking you to accept that. Mrs. Foster's eyes had filled with tears. Amelia, please, come home. Just visit at least. See what you're giving up. I know what I'm giving up, Amelia had said softly, and I know what I'm keeping. My choice stands. Charlie shook his head, remembering. Mr. Foster tried everything, offered Carrick money to release her from the marriage, threatened to contest the legality of it, even suggested that Carrick had taken advantage of a vulnerable woman. How did that go? Tommy asked. Carrick walked him to the door, Charlie said. Politely, but firmly. Told him he was welcome to return when he could treat his daughter with the respect she deserved, but not before. The Fosters had left as the sun was setting. The hired wagon had carried them back toward town, Mrs. Foster weeping, Mr. Foster stiff with outrage. Amelia had stood on the porch watching them go. Carrick had stood beside her, not speaking, just present. I hurt them, she'd said finally. You chose yourself, Carrick had replied. That's not the same as hurting them. Will they ever forgive me? Maybe, maybe not. He'd put his arm around her shoulders. But you can't live your life waiting for their approval. Amelia had leaned into him. Thank you for standing with me, for not taking their offer. I'd never take their offer, Carrick had said. You're not property to be bought or sold. You're my wife, my partner, my... I know, she'd whispered. I know. They'd gone inside as darkness fell. Neither of them had noticed the clouds building on the western horizon, the way the temperature was dropping, the smell of snow on the wind. Charlie's voice grew quieter. That night, the blizzard hit. Not the first snow of the season, the real thing, the kind that could last for weeks, the kind that killed cattle and people both if they weren't prepared. He finished his whiskey, and that night Carrick started to get sick. The wind had woken them in the small hours. Not normal wind, this was something else. A roar like a train, shaking the house, rattling the windows. Carrick had gotten up, gone to look outside, but there was nothing to see, just white. Horizontal snow driven by wind so fierce it couldn't be measured. We're in for it, he'd said, coming back to bed. Amelia had reached for him in the darkness, found him shivering. Carrick, you're freezing. Just cold from the window, but his voice had sounded rough. By morning, it was clear he was sick. Fever burning through him, cough settling deep in his chest. He'd tried to get up anyway, to do the chores that couldn't be neglected. Amelia had pushed him back down. You're staying in bed. Tell me what needs doing. Amelia, you can't. I can and I will. Tell me. So he'd told her, his voice getting weaker as the fever climbed. The cattle needed hay, the horses needed water, the chickens needed feed. Someone had to break the ice on the water troughs. Someone had to check the barn doors were secure against the wind. Amelia had dressed in layers. Carrick's spare coat over her own, 2 scarves wrapped around her face, gloves that were too big but warm. She'd stepped out into the blizzard, and immediately understood how people died in weather like this. The wind stole her breath. The cold bit through every layer. The snow was so thick she couldn't see the barn 30 feet from the house. But she'd tied a rope from the porch to the barn door, the way Carrick had taught her weeks ago. Held onto that rope like her life depended on it. Because it did. She'd fed the horses, broken ice with an axe, her hands going numb even through the gloves, thrown hay to the cattle huddled in the lee of the barn, collected eggs from chickens that pecked at her angrily. It had taken 3 hours to do what normally took Carrick 45 minutes. When she'd stumbled back into the house, she'd been shaking so hard she could barely close the door. Ice had formed in her eyelashes, her hair. Her fingers had been white and nerveless. She'd warmed herself by the fire, forced down hot coffee, then checked on Carrick. He'd been worse. The fever had climbed higher. He was delirious, muttering about fires and screams and orders he couldn't follow. The war had come back to claim him. Amelia had bathed his face with cool water, forced broth between his lips when he was lucid enough to swallow, piled blankets on him when he shook with cold, stripped them off when the fever burned too hot. And outside the blizzard had howled. Charlie set his empty glass on the bar with finality. "That's where I'll leave you tonight," he said. With Amelia alone in a blizzard, Carrick burning with fever, and no help coming. The roads were impassable, the nearest neighbors 3 miles away through waist-deep snow. Tommy looked stricken. "But they survive, right? You said you saw them years later." "I did," Charlie confirmed. "But survival and living are two different things. What happened in that long winter, what Amelia had to become, what Carrick had to face, what they both had to sacrifice, that's the heart of the story." He stood reaching for his coat. "The crying bride who stepped off my coach that September day, she was gone forever after that winter. In her place was someone harder, stronger, forged by cold and fear and necessity into something the frontier couldn't break." The saloon was silent. "Next time," Charlie said, "I'll tell you about the longest night, when Amelia had to choose between staying with her dying husband or going out into a blizzard to save their cattle. When she learned what partnership really costs." He settled his hat on his head. "Love's easy when the weather's fair. It's the winter that shows you what you're really made of." He walked out into the cold Wyoming night, leaving the men to imagine what that winter must have been like. And in their imaginations, it couldn't come close to the truth. Charlie didn't return to the saloon for 3 days. When he finally walked in that Saturday evening, the same group of men were waiting. Tommy had saved the stool beside him. "Thought you weren't coming back," Tommy said as Charlie settled in. "Had freight to Laramie." Charlie accepted the whiskey the bartender poured without asking. "But I don't leave stories unfinished." The men drew closer. "You left Amelia alone," Tommy prompted. "Carrick sick with fever. The blizzard lasted 6 days," Charlie said. 6 days of wind that never stopped, snow that buried fences, cold that could freeze a man solid in an hour if he wasn't careful." He took a sip. "And on the 4th night, the wolves came." Amelia had been awake for nearly 40 hours. Sleep wasn't possible. Carrick's fever would spike, and she'd have to cool him down. Then it would break, and he'd shake so hard the bed rattled. She'd pile blankets on him, hold him through the shaking, whisper things she hoped he could hear. "Stay with me. Please stay with me." Outside, the wind never stopped. It howled like something alive and angry. Snow had drifted halfway up the windows. The world had shrunk to this house, this room, this man burning up in front of her. She'd been changing the cloth on his forehead when she heard it. A sound cutting through the wind, high and eerie. Wolves. Her blood went cold. The cattle were in the near pasture, huddled against the barn, vulnerable. The horses were in the barn itself, but the doors, had she secured them properly? She couldn't remember. Everything was a blur of exhaustion and fear. The howling came again, closer now. Carrick stirred, muttering, "Fire, get out." She's still inside. His nightmares had gotten worse. He was back at Stones River, watching that house burn, living it over and over while fever consumed him. Amelia looked at him, then at the window where darkness pressed close. The cattle were their livelihood. Lose the herd, and they'd lose the ranch. Everything Carrick had built over 5 years, everything they'd need to survive. But if she left him, if his fever spiked while she was gone, the decision felt impossible. Stay with her dying husband, or save everything they owned. Then she remembered what Martha had said weeks ago. Love isn't about keeping each other safe from pain. It's about facing what needs facing. Amelia bent over Carrick. kissed his burning forehead. "I'll be back," she whispered. "I promise." She didn't know if he heard her. Charlie's voice was quiet now. Every man in the saloon was leaning forward. She dressed in every layer she owned, took Carrick's rifle, the Winchester he'd taught her to shoot, loaded it with hands that shook from more than cold. The rope from house to barn was buried under 3 feet of snow. Amelia had to dig for it, find it by memory, and feel. The wind tried to tear her away. The cold stabbed through every layer. She held that rope like a lifeline, because that's what it was. The barn was dark. She'd brought a lantern, but the wind kept trying to blow it out. The cattle were there, 40 of them pressed together, their breath steaming. The horses whinnied, nervous. Then she heard it again, closer now, just beyond the barn. Wolves. She'd never heard wolves before coming to Wyoming. The sound was nothing like dogs. This was wild and hungry and calculating. Amelia moved to the barn door, opened it a crack. Yellow eyes gleamed in the darkness. 5 of them. No, 7. Big prairie wolves driven down from the high country by hunger and cold. They were circling the cattle, testing, looking for weakness. Her hands found the rifle. She'd never shot at a living thing before, had only practiced on tin cans and fence posts. But Carrick had told her, shoot to kill or don't shoot at all. Wounding a wolf makes it desperate. Desperate is dangerous. She raised the rifle, sighted on the closest wolf, pulled the trigger. The sound echoed across the valley, Charlie said. Martha Brennan heard it from 3 miles away. Knew someone was in trouble but couldn't reach them through the storm. The first wolf dropped. The others scattered, but not far. They regrouped in the darkness beyond the lantern's light. Amelia worked the lever, another round in the chamber. Her shoulder ached from the rifle's kick, but she ignored it. The wolves came again, 2 of them this time, testing different angles. She shot, missed, worked the lever, shot again. The second wolf yelped and retreated. Hit, but not killed. Desperate is dangerous. The pack circled. Amelia's hands were shaking now, from cold, from fear, from exhaustion that made her vision blur. She had maybe 6 rounds left. 7 wolves, maybe more in the darkness. The numbers didn't favor her. Then she remembered something else Carrick had taught her. You don't have to kill them all. Just convince them easier prey exists somewhere else. She fired into the air, worked the lever, fired again, making noise, making herself bigger than she was. The wolves backed off, watched from the darkness with those calculating eyes. Amelia stood in the barn doorway, rifle ready, for 2 hours. Her legs went numb. Her fingers couldn't feel the trigger anymore, but she didn't move. The wolves eventually left. She heard them moving off, finding easier hunting elsewhere. She waited another hour to be sure, then stumbled back to the house along that rope, the rifle clutched in frozen hands. Carrick was thrashing when she got inside. The fever had spiked higher. He was calling for someone named Patterson, then Elizabeth, then screaming at invisible flames. Amelia had stripped off her frozen layers with fingers that barely worked, forced herself back to the bed, back to the endless work of keeping him alive. She bathed his face, forced water between his lips, held him when he shook. And when dawn finally came gray and cold through the windows, she realized she'd done it. She'd saved the cattle, saved the ranch, saved herself, all while her husband fought his own battle with fever and memory. The blizzard broke on the 6th day, Charlie said. The wind finally died. The snow stopped. The sun came out, and the world was so bright it hurt to look at. Joseph Brennan reached the Montgomery Ranch first. He'd been trying for 3 days, but the drifts had been too deep. Now he rode slowly through snow that came up to his horse's chest. He'd expected to find the ranch in ruins, expected dead cattle, maybe worse. Instead, he found the barn secure, the cattle alive, the doors properly latched. And inside the house, Amelia Montgomery sitting beside her husband's bed, still awake, still keeping watch. She looked up when Joseph entered. Her eyes were hollow with exhaustion. Her hands were wrapped in bandages where frostbite had bitten deep. "Mr. Brennan," she said, her voice hoarse, "can you ride for the doctor?" Joseph had looked at Carrick, pale and still. "How long has he been like this?" "6 days. The fever broke this morning, but I don't know if—" Her voice had cracked. "Please, I don't know what else to do." Joseph had ridden hard for town, brought back the doctor and Martha both. "Doc Harrison said later it was a miracle Carrick survived," Charlie said. "Pneumonia that bad, with fever that high, most men would have died. But Amelia had done everything right. Kept him cool when the fever spiked, warm when it broke, forced fluids when he could swallow, never let up." It was 3 more days before Carrick's eyes opened clear and aware. He'd looked around the room, confused, then focused on Amelia sleeping in the chair beside the bed, her bandaged hands in her lap. "Amelia?" His voice had been a rasp, but it was his own. Not the fever dreams, not the war ghosts. She'd woken immediately, crossed to the bed. "You're awake, really awake." What happened? He'd tried to sit up, failed. "How long?" 9 days. "You had pneumonia. The doctor said—" She'd stopped, started again. "You almost died." Carrick had looked at her properly then, seen the exhaustion, the bandaged hands, the shadows under her eyes. "You stayed with me." "Of course I stayed with you. The ranch, the cattle, are fine. The barn's secure. We only lost 3 head, and that was before the worst of it." He'd stared at her. "Before? How did you—" "I did what needed doing." She'd sat on the edge of the bed. "The same as you would have. Your hands? Frostbite. Not bad. They'll heal." "Amelia." His voice had been wondering. What did you do? So she'd told him about the wolves, about standing in the barn doorway for 2 hours with the rifle, about the endless cycle of tending him and tending the ranch and never sleeping and never stopping. When she'd finished, Carrick had been quiet for a long time. "I'm sorry," he'd said finally. "For what?" "For doubting you. That first day, when you stepped off the coach crying, I wondered if you'd be strong enough for this life." He'd reached for her hand, careful of the bandages. "I should have known. You were already stronger than all of us." Charlie paused for a drink. The whiskey burned less now, or maybe he was just used to it. "News spread fast once the roads cleared," he said. "Folks heard what Amelia had done, how she'd kept the ranch running alone, fought off wolves, saved her husband's life." The first visitor had been Sarah Jenkins. She'd come on a cold March morning when the snow was melting and the air smelled of spring. Amelia had answered the door to find Sarah standing there, holding a basket. "Mrs. Montgomery," Sarah had said, "may I come in?" They'd sat in the parlor. Sarah had set the basket on the table. Bread, preserves, a jar of honey. "I owe you an apology," Sarah had said without preamble. "Several apologies, actually." Amelia had waited. "When you first arrived, I convinced myself you weren't good enough, that you were some desperate woman who'd tricked Carrick into marriage." Sarah's hands had twisted in her lap. "I spread doubts, made snide comments, tried to make you feel unwelcome." "I know," Amelia had said quietly. "I was cruel, and I was wrong." Sarah had looked up, meeting Amelia's eyes. "Carrick rejected my attentions 2 years ago. He was kind about it, but it hurt. When he sent east for a bride instead of reconsidering me, I let that hurt turn into something ugly." She'd taken a breath. "Then I heard what you did this winter. How you stood alone in that blizzard and didn't break. How you fought for this ranch like it was yours by right of blood, not just marriage." Tears had filled Sarah's eyes. "I understood then why he chose you, why he was right to choose you." Amelia had reached across the table, took Sarah's hand. "I forgive you," she'd said simply. "We all carry pain. The question is what we do with it." Sarah had cried then, real tears, not the polite kind, and Amelia had held her hand through it. "Can we start over?" Sarah had asked when the tears stopped. "I'd like that." After that, Sarah became one of Amelia's closest friends, Charlie said. Funny how things work. The woman who tried hardest to push her away ended up being the one who understood her best. He smiled. "But that's not the end of the story. See, there's one more piece, one more visitor, Amelia wasn't expecting. June came warm and green. The ranch had survived winter. Carrick had recovered his strength, though he still coughed some when the weather changed. The cattle were healthy. The land was blooming. Amelia was hanging laundry when she heard the wagon. She'd looked up to see a familiar hired rig, and climbing down from it, looking older and somehow smaller, were her parents. Harrison Foster had helped his wife down carefully. They'd stood there uncertain while Amelia walked toward them across the yard. "Father, Mother, Amelia." Her mother's voice had been quiet. "We hope it's all right that we've come. We should have written first, but it's all right," Amelia had said. "You're welcome here." They'd looked different somehow, less sure of themselves, less certain they knew what was right. "We heard," her father had said, "from the hotel keeper in town. About the blizzard. About what you did. We wanted to see for ourselves," her mother had added. "See that you were truly all right." Amelia had gestured toward the house. "Come inside. I'll make coffee." They stayed 3 days, Charlie said, and in those 3 days something changed. They saw how Carrick looked at their daughter, how she moved through the ranch with confidence and purpose, how the community respected her, not for her family name, but for what she'd earned herself. On the 3rd evening, Amelia's father had asked to speak with her on the porch. The sunset was painting everything gold. Cattle grazed in the distance. "I was wrong," he'd said. "About this place, about your husband, about you." Amelia had waited. "You're not the daughter I raised," he'd continued. "You're someone stronger, someone I'm not sure I would have had the courage to become." He'd turned to face her fully. "I came here planning to make one last attempt to bring you home. But I see now you are home, more than you ever were in Boston." "Yes," Amelia had said simply. "I am." Her father had nodded. "Then I'm asking your forgiveness, for not defending you when you needed it, for letting that scandal drive you away, for not seeing your strength until you'd already left." Amelia had felt tears prick her eyes. "I forgive you, Father. I forgave you a long time ago." They'd embraced then, and something old and painful had finally healed between them. Charlie signaled for one last pour. The bottle came down. The amber liquid caught the lamplight. "That's the main story," he said. "The crying bride who became someone new. But you want to know the end? The real end?" The men nodded. "All right then. Let me tell you about last spring, 1890, 17 years after I brought Amelia to Willow Creek. Charlie had been driving the same route, though everything else had changed. Willow Creek was a real town now. Railroad had come through in 79. Population had tripled. They had a proper school, 2 churches, even a small newspaper. He'd made a delivery to the Montgomery Ranch, bringing supplies they'd ordered from Cheyenne. The ranch had changed too. Bigger house now, with an addition on the back. New barn, twice the size of the old one. Corrals that could hold 100 head of cattle. This was a prosperous operation, well run and thriving. A young man had come out to help unload. Tall, strong, with his father's build and his mother's blue eyes. "You must be James," Charlie had said. "Yes, sir. And you're Mr. Hendricks. My father speaks of you often." A girl had appeared on the porch, 14 or so, with honey blonde hair and a book tucked under her arm. "That's Caroline," James had said fondly. "Smart as a whip, going to be a teacher like Mother was." Then Amelia herself had emerged from the house. Charlie had stared. 17 years had passed, but he would have known her anywhere. Older, yes. Lines around her eyes from squinting at horizons. Hands permanently work-roughened. But there was something else. Something that hadn't been there that first day. She was laughing. Carrick had come from the barn, moving a bit slower than he used to, but still solid, still capable. He'd wrapped an arm around his wife's waist, and they'd stood there together, easy with each other in the way only long-married couples could be. "Mr. Hendricks," Amelia had said warmly, "won't you stay for supper? We'd love to hear news from your travels." Charlie had stayed, had eaten with the family around a table full of warmth and conversation, had watched Carrick and Amelia's hands find each other without thought, the way roots find water. After supper, he'd been leaving when Amelia had walked him to his wagon. "Thank you," she'd said, "for bringing me here all those years ago, for being patient with a crying woman who didn't know what she needed." "You knew," Charlie had said. "You were just afraid to hope for it." She'd smiled. "Maybe, but I'm not afraid anymore." He'd driven away that evening with the sound of her laughter following him down the road. Charlie finished his whiskey, set the glass down gently. "So that's the story," he said to the men in the saloon. "The crying bride of Willow Creek. You asked me if mail-order marriages work, and I told you most don't." He stood, reaching for his coat. "But when they do, when two people decide to build something on truth instead of lies, on partnership instead of possession, on faith instead of fear, well, that's when you get something rare, something that lasts." Tommy spoke up. "The parents? Did they ever reconcile fully?" "They came back every summer until they died," Charlie said. "Mrs. Foster even helped deliver Caroline. Cried when she held her granddaughter. Said she'd never been prouder of anyone than she was of Amelia." He settled his hat on his head. "The thing about love is this. It's not found in the easy moments, not in the tears at the station or the kiss at the altar. It's found in the blizzards, in the choices to stay when leaving would be easier. In the wolves we face down because something worth protecting stands behind us." Charlie moved toward the door, then paused. Carrick Montgomery died in '88. Heart gave out one evening while he was sitting on the porch. Amelia was holding his hand when it happened. She told me later, at his funeral, that he went peaceful. Said he smiled at her just before, and his last words were, "You never did have to pretend." The saloon was silent. "She still runs the ranch. James manages the day-to-day now, but Amelia's the heart of it. And when folks ask her about her marriage, about those early days, she tells them the truth." "What truth?" someone asked. Charlie smiled. "That she got on my coach in Boston crying because she thought she was running away from shame, and got off in Willow Creek still crying because she realized she was running toward something better." He opened the door. Cold air rushed in. "Best marriages are the ones that start honest and stay that way, where two people see each other clear, scars and all, and choose each other anyway." Charlie stepped out into the Wyoming night. Behind him, he heard Tommy's voice. "That's the best damn love story I ever heard." And Charlie smiled, because it was true. The moon was rising over Cheyenne as Charlie walked the familiar streets toward his boarding house. Somewhere out there, 4 days' ride northwest, Amelia Montgomery was probably sitting on her porch looking at the same moon. Maybe thinking about the crying girl she'd been. Maybe grateful for the woman she'd become. The frontier had a way of stripping things down to what mattered. Out here, you couldn't pretend. The land wouldn't let you. The weather wouldn't let you. The sheer weight of survival wouldn't let you. You either became who you truly were or you broke. Amelia had become herself, and in doing so had given Carrick permission to become himself too. Two wounded people finding healing in honesty. That, Charlie thought as he climbed the stairs to his room, was worth all the tears shed getting there. In the distance, a train whistle sounded, heading west, always west, carrying more dreamers toward the frontier. Some would make it. Most wouldn't. But every now and then, someone like Amelia Foster would step off a coach in tears and find exactly what she'd been looking for all along. Not escape, not rescue, just a chance to be real. And sometimes Charlie knew that was enough.